Hello everybody, this is the Obscure Titan with a special episode. Today we take a look at Conker's presidency and how his legacy as the 41st president could affect America differently as opposed to what we have in our current timeline. Of course, this take is fictitious, so it would not happen at all. But let's say if we have our own equivalent to the take in a way that I have in our current timeline. Someone in real life that may have similar views as Conker's, either it be Patrick Buchanan or Mike Huckabee. It's essentially how it would go. I won't go beyond 2012 since it's just going to go over specific events as to how they'll be resolved under Conker and a few others. Those key issues are Osama bin Laden, the 9/11 attack, Hurricane Katrina, the 2008 recession, and the Afghanistan war. Two fictional issues being Space Godzilla and the Neo-Satanic Brigade under Etna, who becomes empress of her new empire. And it's just as National Socialist as Mr. Lake's defunct faction in 1984. Now let's get started.
I'm gonna get tanked tonight.
To start this off, we'll take a look at our current timeline. Reagan of California took 98.8% of the popular vote, whereas his challenger Harold Stassen of Minnesota only took 0.19%, with about more than 6 million against 12,000. The thing is that Reagan is really popular in the 1980s. He's not only pretty good with the economy, but also a really solid leader on many issues and has been limiting federal intervention, which allowed the states to have their own freedom.
There you go again.
Now, where this changes in the Megatronic legacy continuity is that Conker is the challenger. He turns 35 on March 5th during the Republican primary. It would be from February 20th to July 1st. Conker would be able to make it on time to do so, since I mentioned in my Conker video that you need to be 35 years and older to run for president, aside from being a US born citizen and having been a citizen. Now, let's take more than 6 million votes into consideration by taking them in the addition of over 300,000. Are there any Promethean who became US citizens or US voters who want a more appealing challenger than both Reagan and Stassen? That makes about nearly 7 million votes together. Here's how I would plan out in this comparison. Ronald Reagan would get about 6 million votes, which would still almost be the same but less, with Conker only getting over 200,000 votes. In this continuity, Reagan still takes the lead and remains the nominee. However, Conker would garner roughly 28% of the popular vote, while the former has about 72%. Stassen is a liberal Republican who seems to have supported liberal talking points, such as supporting a form of universal basic income. Conker, by contrast, would be more of a moderate. Think of it in the lines of Teddy Roosevelt or Dwight Eisenhower, where the Red Scroll would tackle on issues that lands him in the right, such as national populism and cutting taxes, probably to get an even greater extent than Reagan. Conker would allow Promethean citizens to move to America, but he'd also have to build a system that legally lets them into America, regardless of what planet they come from. He would ensure that America remains an anti-communist country and not allow illegal crossing. I mentioned that Conker works in between jobs and makes enough money to pay for the deficit and other things that America has to remain afloat. That being said, Reagan still holds nomination and Conker would need to prep up for his next move 4 years later, in 1988.
I'm gonna get tanked tonight.
Conker returns for the 1988 election and faces against Vice President George Bush, Robert Dole, and Patrick Robertson. While Conker only won around 28% against Ronald Reagan in '84, he would make an edge over Bush and other Republican candidates. I think Conker could win roughly about 52% of the vote, with Bush and Dole having only about 18%, the former only having about 5% higher, and Robertson with less than 7%. Conker could carry 27 delegates, with Bush gaining 19. Conker wins the nomination based on his views similar to Bush, but takes a more aggressive approach to the problems that could come up. The dismantling of the Soviet Union is one of them, but the takedown of Osama bin Laden being a tough one to handle, especially for establishment neoconservatives. Conker's running mate would be Banjo Bear. He wanted Sierra to be his running mate, but the Republican Party at the time is gearing more towards the neoconservative establishment, and Banjo is something you'd imagine Mitt Romney or George W. Bush are. The Red Scroll takes a more moderate view as a national populist. He even paid much of his earnings to pay for the deficit Reagan barely mentioned in his farewell address in 1989. He even took jabs at Bush when he said he wouldn't raise taxes, which Bush certainly did turn back on his conservative voters.
Read my lips.
There is one more challenger in this election, Altus D. Angelica. As an independent, she shares similar traits that Ross Perot and Donald Trump would propose during the 90s. However, she doesn't get as far as she hoped to, since Conker would already have some of her traits, probably tougher on the issues. Conker becomes the Republican nomination and faces Democratic Michael Dukakis in the election. As opposed to Bush's run, Conker wins Washington, Oregon, Wisconsin, and West Virginia at a narrow margin. and California, New Mexico, and Illinois being his home state at the time, leaning closer to the red squirrel. Altus would only get Iowa by a tilt margin due to a split in the vote between her and Dukakis. Lean in Maryland, likely in Massachusetts, and safe in Vermont. 3 states going to Dukakis, New York, Minnesota, and Rhode Island, are all tilt, with DC being the only safe Democrat state. Conker wins 450 electoral votes against Dukakis' 53 and Altus' 34. As Conker enters office, he signs a few additional legislations along with the ones that Bush signed, and maybe at an earlier date. The first being the You Owe Me Act. This one is specific for politicians running for governor, senator, and federal government. Each representative would be obligated to pay a certain amount of money to help balance the deficit in people's living, because we are paying taxes for living in America. With that, this would affect future presidents and politicians entering office, whether they pay a fifth, half, or all of their checks. That would benefit America long term. The recession in early 1992 isn't as severe as it was in our current timeline. It may still be an issue given the Gulf War, but Conker's economic policies would keep it from hurting American citizens. The second is the Caught Dead-Handed Act. This is specifically for creeps who prey upon children. All that requires is sufficient evidence and witness integrity. This allows victims the right to execute their abusers who preyed on their children without repercussion. Another highlight to Conker's presidency, and an honor to the Second Amendment. The third is building a thing which he calls the Big Ol' Fence. This is specific to the rising immigration following Reagan's mass amnesty in 1986. Conker isn't as keen on everything Reagan proposes despite being in the same party and even being friends.
I'm gonna get tanked tonight.
This leads to the 1992 election. While things seemed to be good, only one thing remained: the Neo-Satanic Brigade. Etna and her allies managed to get intel from Margadora, taking advantage of the American national security. This does cause concern that President Conker could end up making the same mistake as Jimmy Carter did in 1979 in the Iran hostile crisis, though he assured that he will be firing back at Etna's brigade with immense force. Conker's challengers, Democratic Bill Clinton and Independent Ross Perot, enter the race as the nominees of their own affiliations against the incumbent president. The map would still go to Conker by around 52%, whereas Perot gets a little over 25% should his Reform Party actually get somewhere and not drop out, and Clinton only getting less than 23%. Now, you'd say Bill Clinton could actually win at a narrow margin against Conker, given his moderate stance on his policies, but Conker's won more accomplishments than he's lost, and he killed Osama bin Laden, who is a very deadly enemy aside from nasty Norcan terror attacks. Regardless, the Reform Party is legit, and Conker is re-elected for 4 more years. This results Zirma to change her affiliations to the Reform Party despite being a good friend to Conker. This will act out in the Celestial Calamity arc. President Conker rallies up world leaders for an intergalactic battle with Unicron, Primus, and Megatron's convoy. He urges that they all fight together in order to preserve their freedom from totalitarian control. Once Primus, Unicron, and Megatron's convoy are defeated, Conker's approval rating went up as high as 91%. He creates a speech that's equivalent to Reagan's Tear Down This Wall speech and assures a peaceful era in his post-presidency in 1997. Sadly, this doesn't follow in Banjo's presidency.
I'm gonna get tanked tonight.
Before we get into Banjo's presidency, we should take a look at the map. What could change in the national environment is the GOP would be more focused in the white working class and the Promethean voters. The Neoconservative Party is popular in states like Texas, Utah, Alaska, and Georgia, being establishment territories. The Democratic Party would be more geared to the blue-collar class, while the Northeast is more geared to the Reform Party, with more Promethean support. Banjo wins 218 electoral votes, Ross Perot is at 148, George W. Bush is 101, and Al Gore is 71. However, the ratio would be razor thin, only about 2,000 votes away. But this is where things get more complicated. Frustrated with the neoconservatives leaning more to where Robert Dole and Mitt Romney are heading towards, Conker finishes his second term, leaves office in 1997 without giving Banjo a handshake. Prior to Banjo's near margin victory, Conker has made interviews with his problems with Banjo and how his inability to lead could result into something like 9/11 in our current timeline. Conker was disappointed that the Republicans turned away from Sierma and Altus's policies, somewhat center liberal on some issues, but primarily right, especially being national populists themselves. The Republican Party did not want them in their faction. After Conker left office, he re-registers from his Republican allegiance to the Reform Party in mid-1997. With the summer of 1998, Space Godzilla shows up out of nowhere and begins terrorizing parts of the world and eventually America. While the World Trade Center doesn't come down, the Pentagon and the White House would get attacked. Banjo tried getting other world leaders to fight off Godzilla without any compensation to make up for his inability to lead. Even worse, he went behind his voters' backs and taxed them, similar to George Bush in our timeline. Something equivalent to George W. Bush's Bankruptcy, Abuse Prevention, and Consumer Protection Act, Banjo would make it so. His excuse was if people were making too much money or not enough, he makes it to the point where it's farther than what Bush did, something that John Kerry would. It got so bad that people were questioning Banjo's leadership and believed Conker was right all along.
I'm gonna get tanked tonight.
It's been 2 years since Space Godzilla arrived to Earth and has been terrorizing it. The economy is heading into a recession and foreign policies are falling apart. Banjo blames it all on Conker for not having a plan to prevent the chaos. Yet Banjo implemented his BAPCP Act and caused more people to suffer, including Promethean immigrants and civilians. The 2000 election draws closer, and comes a four-way election. This time, the Reform Party represents Sierra Meselica, Dick Cheney in the Neoconservative Party, since George W. Bush didn't want to run again, Al Gore attempting his second run for the Democratic Party, and Banjo being the incumbent Republican president. Sierra Meselica runs for a more moderate campaign. She's somewhat liberal on some issues with tax spending, raising taxes on some areas while cutting others, but she's primarily a national populist and has been very tough on foreign policy. Her running mate would be Altis Angelica, and has similar views. The problem for the Democrats is that the Reform Party is becoming the central focus for the country, or Green in this case, and it's going to be much tougher to win them back. In one of the debates before election, Sierra used all of her strategies that hurt Banjo right where it hurts, asking if the people would rather have another Nixon from the Republican Party or another Reagan from the Reform Party. The popular vote was 59% for Sierra, 18% for Banjo, 12% for Al Gore, and less than 10% for Cheney. She wins 275 electoral votes against Banjo's 140, Cheney's 82, and Gore's 41. Sierra and Altis walk to the inauguration with a bazooka and rifle with them as a sign of strength against Space Godzilla. They go join the war against the monster, making them the first U.S. modern presidents to actively join the war themselves, not just declare it. Sierra pushes for a tougher stance on foreign policy and creates bipartisan laws which brought balance to left-wing and right-wing camps. Neither have gone too powerful over the other, and it helps both parties find prosperity. Sierra accomplishes her goal to defeating Space Godzilla with a new legion of intergalactic heroes, and brings down the Neo-Satanic Brigade. The Silica administration captures Etna, the economy is restored to Reagan levels of prosperity, and civil unrest has ceased. All of which was done by the end of 2003.
I'm gonna get tanked tonight.
Sierra faces little competition due to her influence. The neoconservative and Democratic parties tried having John McCain and John Kerry run, but their impact meant nothing to the election. All that was left was Elizabeth Kazooie, Banjo's VP. Because of Banjo's poor reception during his presidency, the Republican Party stood no chance of beating Reform Sierra. Once again, she reminds the American people of Banjo and his influence to the Prometheans in the country, winning in a landslide victory at 499, with over 78% of the popular vote, 11% to Kazooie, 5% to John Kerry, and only 2% for John McCain, and 4% for undecided. Sierra wins with 4 more years, and it continues in another part of the era in prosperity. At this point, Space Godzilla is vanquished, the Neo-Satanic Brigade is crushed, 9/11 averted long ago, economy is balanced, and civilization is restored under her administration. As Hurricane Katrina commences in August 2005, Sierra forms an emergency plan to call for an environmental protection plan which can be triggered if severe weather occurs. She essentially has weather borders to keep floods from coming in. There is one catch: the 2008 recession. It will not be as severe since Sierra would implement a piece of legislation to counteract against Banjo's flawed BAPCP Act. In order to prevent the recession from becoming a problem, she would need to balance the amount of money spent, taxes cut, and trading deals. The recession still happens, but it's minimal. Specifically gas prices, but not going higher than $3 per gallon. And a select few store items increased to only 1.5%. It's because of the few wars happened with Space Godzilla and Neo-Satanic Brigade. The good news for Sierra is that Conker's You Owe Me Act got politicians to contribute their checks to balance the deficit in taxes.
I'm gonna get tanked tonight.
Following the quick disappearance of the 2008 recession, Sierra is a popular president, up to 89% approval in the office. And Altis has garnered more support to be the Reform nominee for the 2008 election. GOP Stephen Armstrong, Democrats John Kerry, and neocons Mitt Romney all run to face Altis. However, a fifth party emerges, the Revolution Party. and somewhat more of a center-liberal affiliation where it welcomes liberal voters on key issues which Altus isn't too extreme on. However, not as far left as the Democratic Party is. The Revolution Party's nominee goes to David L. Snake. That said, this is where things get messy. Armstrong takes a more conspiracy theorist approach in his debates, labeling Altus as a far-left feminist, which backfires horribly, by correcting him by advocating her national populist policies and her stances to carry over Conker's trade deal legislation. Not only has the Democratic Party lost their touch in both the West Coast and Northeast, but those areas are already favorable to the Reform Party. The Revolution Party also garnered more favor in places such as Minnesota, Vermont, and Massachusetts. Mitt Romney did garner a bit more recognition in Texas and Utah, though still a bit behind Altus. The Reform nominee garners over 64% of the popular vote, while Romney and Armstrong each get around 12%, whereas Snake got less than 6% and John Kerry only 2%. Altus's first term in office would be similar to that of Reagan or Clinton's second term as far as economics and foreign policies go. So far, the only major event going on in Altus's first term is North Korea. She makes a deal with Kim Jong that so long as she remains in power, Kim can't cause any wars. Otherwise, she brings the missile hammer to his country like he has to other countries, and just recently with Japan in our timeline. There are some complications with Altus's Senate. At this point, the Senate went Republican in 1994 up until 2006 when the Reform Party won it by a small margin, but then 2012 when it went Republican, which is earlier than our timeline. However, Altus isn't as friendly to neoconservative folks as she is to the national populists and independent voters. Mitt Romney has been a very vocal opponent to Altus, which will play out in her 2012 election.
I'm gonna get tanked tonight.
In this election, Altus runs for re-election, but while Mitt Romney tries running for president, he was chased out by a Henry Johnson. Yes, that's Sergeant Johnson in Halo. In this canon, Johnson was a Cold War vet who wanted to run for president to bring back to the old-school conservative agenda. Imagine Sergeant Johnson as Brandon Tatum, but tougher on the language barrier. Jack Ryden would be the Revolution's nominee, hoping to get more people to vote for him and eventually did compare to Snake last time. But Altus is considered the safe alternative as she's not too far right or far left. Altus wins about 54% of the popular vote, Johnson's 25%, Ryden's 16%, and 5% either to undecided or to other candidates like Mitt Romney. At this point, the Democratic Party is pretty much dead. Altus is re-elected for 4 more years and made some remarkable accomplishments. In this, she introduces the creation of flying cars in America, stable economic and job growth, minimal illegal immigration, unemployment at an all-time low, and excellent foreign relationships. North Korea is defeated and eventually turned into a capitalist system from its communist control. So far, no known wars have started and Altus is very popular, with the approval rating of 94%, being the highest since Conker's 91% during his second term in the mid-90s. Food and gas prices are relatively low, the latter being close to $1.79 per gallon. More people are working and the working class don't suffer a massive tax burden like what happened on our timeline. Altus is even rewarded for the Nobel Peace Prize for easing tensions or respecting the legacy Conker and Seymour left off for America. And so far, Altus is ranked as one of the best presidents, and a great representative for the Promethean Americans.
I'm gonna get tanked tonight.
I don't think we really need to look at 2016 and onwards. I get that we could look into things like COVID or racial relations, but it's best to say that the Reform Party in this continuity has eased tensions for America, and it's thanks to the Red Squirrel Boy. Despite being Republican at first, Conker's bipartisan and national populist ideals have helped push for a third party to become relevant, which means that more parties could come to challenge one another. Instead of just having Republicans and Democrats, we could see others such as revolutionists, the reformists, libertarians, and some actually winning Senate seats and such. I know this isn't as important as the rest of the episodes, but I felt that it was still worth going into as to how Conker's presidency would affect America. That's all the episodes, and this time, I am done doing these for a while. I'll do some production updates here and there, but nothing major to put up until Norgarchy comes out. Thanks for watching, feel free to like and subscribe if you're new and enjoy my content, and I'll catch you next time. Over and out.
Yeah, I think the round's on me. I'm gonna get tanked tonight.